How in the world do we learn how to trust each other again? You know, that's a question that's been on my mind a lot lately, and I bet it's probably been on your mind. I've had high school teachers ask me this. I've had business owners ask me this. I've had community activists ask me this. How do we trust each other again? You know, it's what seems like so much damage to the fabric of our society over the last 6 months in particular, that it's really hard to imagine how we're going to bring it back together, but we have to. And that was really the subject of my webinar, Leading Through the Churn, was that this social tension that we're experiencing between us and the other folks in our arena that really stands between where we are and our higher purpose and our goals, to maintain a society of abundance and individual freedom that we can hand to our kids. It's really pronounced right now. The last 6 months were tough. The next 6 months are going to be even tougher. And there's 3 components to the churn. And by the way, the churn is the external enemy to the Rooftop leader. It is the enemy we must defeat. There's 3 components to it. There's distraction, there's disengagement, and there's distrust. And distrust is the worst. I've seen versions of the churn all over the world as a Green Beret working in low trust societies. That churn is always in place. So I've got some perspective on it that I want to share with you. And I want to try to answer this question. How do we learn to trust each other again so that we can leave this place better than we found it for our kids? I mean, that's really what I'm putting forward here. And, you know, I'm reminded of a mission set that we did in Arghandab, Kandahar province in 2010. One of the Special Forces teams that was in there working to try to get village stability in place, to empower locals to fight back on their own against Taliban insurgents. There was a split between the 2 tribes that lived in this little village of Adira. One of the tribes was Alakazai, a large tribe they had a lot of land, they had a lot of wealth. And then there was a smaller tribe, a minority tribe called the Kakars. And the Kakars were really sharecroppers. They were kind of on the outside looking in. They lived on the outskirts of town. They didn't own any land. And so it's not hard to figure out who was aligned with the government and who was aligned with the Taliban, right? But that split ran very deep, and there was a churn there, just like frothing stormy waters in the North Atlantic between these 2 organizations. And so the Green Berets that worked with these 2 tribes knew that they were going to have to overcome that churn. Those 2 groups were going to have to learn how to trust each other again. And this was visceral hatred. This was bonding trust hatred. This was at a tribal level of resource scarcity, status and honor, revenge and feud, hundreds of years old, that needed to be overcome. And there was contempt for each other. And that's what Sebastian Junger talks about in his book, Tribe, is that, you know, contempt is usually something we reserve for our enemies. And certainly there was a high degree of contempt. But the Green Beret team, over time, first they would work individual with each team, and they would focus on creating a vision and a purpose that was bigger than one tribe, one group. In this case, it was water and arable land. And eventually they were able to soften the emotional temperature, start to kind of bring folks together around that vision, eventually put them in the same room, and then over time find common goals that they both stood for and bridge beyond those individual grievances and start to restore trust and build trust anew. And it worked. In less than a year, those 2 tribes were working together on a hydrology project that's still in place to this day, still maintained to this day, and the land is accessible to both tribes. Now, I equate what was happening then to what is happening in our country right now, except that was churn 2.0. This is churn 5.0 in our country. There's a line in my play, Last Out, where my character, Danny Patton, a Green Beret, on the edge of retirement after fighting the longest war in history, says to his wife, Lynn, you know, dying for your country is one thing. I'm fully prepared to do that, but I have no clue how I'm supposed to live for it. And that's the way so many veterans feel today when we see our country tearing ourselves apart. And I want to read to you a little bit about that distrust that Junger writes about in his book, Tribe. Junger was a war correspondent, so he says, I know what coming back to America from a war zone is like because I've done it so many times. First, there is a kind of shock at the level of comfort and affluence that we enjoy. But that is followed by the dismal realization that we live in a society that is basically at war with itself. Now listen to this. Younger says, people speak with incredible contempt about, depending on their views, the rich, the poor, the educated, the foreign-born, the president, or the entire U.S. government. It's a level of contempt that is usually reserved for enemies in wartime, except that it's now applied to our fellow citizens. It's the same contempt I saw between the Alakazai and the Kakar, and we're getting caught up in it. And as a result of that, we're losing our bridging trust society that values abundance and the individual, and we're going to this bonding trust where we only trust the people in our in-group. We only trust the people who are like us. And that's a very, very dangerous, primal place for us to go. Younger goes on to say that contempt, unlike criticism, is particularly toxic because it assumes moral superiority in the speaker. It's often directed at people who have been excluded from a group or declared unworthy of its benefits. And he says people who speak with contempt for one another will probably not remain united for long. That is a shot across the bow for us. So I'm asking you right now, if you feel like you have contempt in your life, do an honest analysis of that. Are you demonstrating contempt for people who wear masks or don't wear masks? Are you demonstrating contempt in how you speak of people for one particular party or another? No matter how righteous you think you are, if you're using contempt in relation to the other party, it is a very, very dangerous path. And it only ends one way, no matter how justified you think your contempt is. And we've lived it as veterans so many times. It closes you off. It makes it impossible to bridge. So here's a couple of things I would ask you to do as a leader who wants to leave this world with abundance and individual freedom for our children better than we found it. One, decide to bridge. Get outside of your in-group and bridge beyond it. You can do that, number two, by asking thoughtful, open-ended questions of people who are different than you. Allow them to respond to you in story and tell you about their journey, their miles, their scars, their pain, their dreams. And third, be curious. Pursue it with discovery. It costs you nothing, even though it feels a little clunky. It's one of the most powerful, validating things you can do as a leader. The reason is simple. The team, the SF team, figured this out, and they learned that if they did those things, they developed a shared perspective. The proverbial water source became a shared perspective. They gained mutual respect for each other, even if they didn't agree, and then that led to reciprocity, a willingness to take a chance on the other party, even though you weren't quite sure what would happen next. Those are the leaders we need in this world. And it starts with learning how to trust again and taking some of those simple steps. Make sure you go to our YouTube channel and you subscribe. I'd love for you to like us, follow us, and more importantly, share it, because we're putting 10 million rooftop leaders into the arena to counter the churn, and it starts with you. Thanks for what you do. I'll see you on the rooftop.